One day before my graduation ceremony, my mother called to tell me she wasn't coming. Your stepsister has her bar exam results coming in that same week, and she needs all of us focused on her right now. You understand, don't you? My stepfather agreed in the background, his voice flat, like he was confirming a dinner reservation and not abandoning his own daughter on the biggest day of her academic life. On the morning of my graduation, I did not walk across that stage alone. When my name was called and I came out from behind the curtain, the entire auditorium turned to look at who was sitting in my family's reserved seats, clapping louder than anyone else in the room. My mother, 3 rows back, went white as chalk. My name is Sienna and I'm 31 years old. I grew up in a brick 2-story in Mississauga, the kind of house with a Canadian flag sticker on the back window of the minivan and a live, laugh, love sign in the front hall that nobody ever lived up to. My mother, Roxanne, remarried when I was 9 to a man named Gerald who came pre-packaged with a daughter exactly my age named Brittany. From the very first dinner, it was obvious who the real daughter in that house was going to be, and it wasn't me. Gerald owned a chain of 3 dental clinics across the GTA, and Roxanne quit her job at a marketing firm to manage the household, which mostly meant managing Brittany's schedule, competitive figure skating, then student council, then eventually law school applications. I got passed down winter coats and a clear, unspoken understanding that I was a guest in my own home who happened to also do the dishes. I want to be fair because even now, knowing everything I know, I try to be fair. Brittany wasn't cruel to me when we were kids. She was just oblivious in the specific way that people are when the world has been arranging itself around them since birth. She never once asked me how my day was, not maliciously. It just never occurred to her that I might have had one. I worked through high school at a Tim Hortons on Dundas Street, saved enough for a used Honda Civic by 17, and got myself into Western for engineering on scholarships and OSAP loans that I am frankly still paying off. Nobody drove up from Mississauga to help me move into residence. Gerald said the timing didn't work with the clinic schedule. Brittany was starting her undergrad at Queen's that same week, and apparently that required the whole family's presence, including a send-off dinner at a restaurant downtown that I only found out about because I saw the photos on Facebook 3 days later. I tell you all of this not to make you feel sorry for me, but so you understand why, by the time I was finishing my master's degree in structural engineering at the University of Toronto, I had stopped expecting anything from that house. I had built an entirely separate life. I had my own apartment in Liberty Village, a job offer waiting from a firm downtown, and a man named Desmond who had become more family to me in 4 years than my actual family had managed in. Desmond wasn't my boyfriend. He was my landlord, originally an older man, maybe 68, who lived in the unit below mine and had emigrated from Trinidad in the 70s. He fixed my leaking faucet the week I moved in and refused to take money for it, and somewhere over the following 4 years of shared Sunday coffees on the building's tiny rooftop patio, he had simply become the person I called when something good or bad happened to me. He came to my thesis defense. He brought a thermos of his wife's sorrel drink, even though his wife had passed years before I met him, because he said the smell of it made him feel like she was still cheering for things with him. When I told him my mother wasn't coming to my convocation, he didn't say anything dramatic. He just looked at me over his reading glasses and asked, very simply, "Who's walking you out then?" I hadn't even known that was a thing you could ask. I told him I supposed I'd just go up alone, the way I'd done most things. "No," he said. "Family seating is family seating. I'll come if you'll have me." I want to explain what convocation looks like for engineering at U of T because the structure matters here. Before the actual ceremony, there's a smaller faculty reception in the atrium of the engineering building, and family members are seated in a roped-off section near the front so they can watch the procession before everyone moves into Convocation Hall. My mother had RSVP'd for 4 seats months earlier, herself, Gerald, Brittany, and Brittany's then-boyfriend, who I'd met exactly twice. The seating chart had been locked in since spring. 3 weeks before the ceremony, Brittany found out her bar exam results would be released the same week, and the family rallying around began in earnest. I got a phone call from my mother that I will remember precisely for the rest of my life, mostly because of how casually she delivered it, like she was telling me they'd be running 10 minutes late for brunch. "Sienna, honey, we've been thinking, and with everything going on with Brittany's results this week, your father and I think it makes more sense if we keep the focus tight. You know, we'll still be so proud of you, obviously. We just can't really do both things justice in the same week." I asked her quite calmly what both things she meant, given that one of those things was her actual daughter completing a master's degree after 6 years of unpaid labor and tuition debt, and the other was a results email landing in someone's inbox. She told me I was being dramatic. Gerald got on the phone briefly to add that the optics of splitting attention weren't fair to Brittany during her vulnerable week, as though my convocation was an inconvenient scheduling conflict in someone else's emotional itinerary. So I called Desmond instead, and he said yes before I'd even finished the sentence. The morning of the ceremony, I wore my mother's old pearl earrings, the one inheritance from my actual late father who'd died when I was 6, that Roxanne had begrudgingly handed over when I turned 18, probably because she'd forgotten she still had them. I did my own makeup in a cracked compact mirror in my apartment, alone, the way I'd done most important mornings of my adult life. Desmond picked me up at 9 in a navy suit that I later learned he'd had tailored specifically for the occasion, with a small gold pin on the lapel that I recognized. It was the same insignia from his own engineering degree, completed decades earlier at the University of the West before he'd immigrated and had to start his career over almost from scratch in a country that didn't initially recognize his credentials. We arrived at the atrium 40 minutes early, and here is where the story turns because my mother's family had also arrived early to claim what they assumed would be an easy, comfortable front row view of a daughter they expected to find sitting quietly off to the side somewhere, unaccompanied exactly as she always had been. Instead, they watched me walk in on the arm of a sharply dressed 70-year-old black man with silver hair and a quiet, unhurried dignity that made several people in that atrium actually stop their conversations to watch him pass. Desmond had that effect on rooms. He always had. My mother's face did something I had genuinely never seen it do before. It went still, then pale, then arranged itself very quickly into something resembling composure, the way it always did in public. Brittany, seated beside her in a dress that cost more than my entire convocation outfit, including the gown rental, leaned over and whispered something to her father, clearly trying to figure out who this man was and why he was sitting in our family's reserved row. Desmond didn't acknowledge them. He simply found our seats, helped me settle my gown, and asked if I wanted water before the procession started, in the same gentle, unbothered voice he used when he was fixing my radiator. The ceremony itself was, in the way these things usually are, both long and somehow over too quickly. I remember almost nothing about the dean's address. What I remember is standing in the wings before my name was called, watching the row of graduates ahead of me cross the stage one by one, and feeling Desmond's eyes on me the entire time, the same way he'd watched me defend my thesis, the same way he watched the kettle when he made tea, like the most important thing happening anywhere in the world was happening right in front of him. When the announcer called my name, Sienna Marlowe, Master of Applied Science, Civil and Structural Engineering. I walked across that stage and I heard, distinct above the polite applause of strangers, one voice cheering loud enough that several professors on the dais actually turned their heads to look. Desmond was on his feet, clapping like I'd just won an Olympic medal, completely unembarrassed, completely unbothered by the fact that nobody else's family member was standing. I didn't look at my mother's row, I didn't need to. I could feel the silence coming off it like cold air through a cracked window. The real conversation happened after, in the atrium, during the reception with the little sandwich trays and the watery coffee, that every Canadian institutional event seems contractually obligated to serve. My mother found me near the photo backdrop, Gerald trailing a few steps behind her, both of them wearing the particular expression of people trying to recover lost ground without admitting there was ground to recover. "Sienna, you could have told us you were bringing someone," she said, her voice pitched low, glancing sideways at Desmond, who was a polite distance away, chatting easily with one of my professors about structural load calculations as though he'd known the man for years. "I didn't think I needed permission to bring my own family to my own graduation," I said. "He's not family," Gerald said, and I watched my mother flinch slightly at how plainly he'd said it, in public, with my professor close enough to half hear it. "He's been more family to me in 4 years than the two of you managed in 30, I told them, and I kept my voice level, the way Desmond always kept his, because I'd apparently absorbed more from him than I'd realized. "You didn't show up when I moved into residence. You didn't show up for my thesis defense. You didn't show up today until you realized I'd shown up anyway, without you, and that bothered you more than my actual achievement ever did." Brittany, to her credit, and I genuinely mean that, because this is the part of the story where she surprised me, had been standing slightly behind her parents this whole time, holding a small congratulations card she'd clearly bought and signed before any of this conversation happened. She stepped forward and held it out to me. "I didn't know they weren't coming," she said quietly. "I thought it was both. I swear I thought it was both." I believed her. That's the strange, complicated truth of it. Brittany had spent her whole life being centered by people who never told her they were doing it at someone else's expense. She wasn't cruel, she was just never required to look. My mother tried weakly to recover the conversation, something about how proud she was, how this didn't change anything, how we could all go for a family dinner that evening to celebrate properly. I told her, gently but completely, that I already had dinner plans, with Desmond, at the Trinidadian restaurant near my apartment where he always ordered for both of us because he insisted I hadn't lived until I'd had proper curry goat made the right way. I want to tell you that what happened over the following months was simple, but it wasn't. Roxanne called twice a week for almost 2 months afterward, in a way she'd never called before, trying to rebuild something on a schedule that suited her timing rather than mine. I didn't ignore her. I just stopped rearranging my entire emotional life around her convenience, which is a different thing than cutting someone off, though I think it confused her at first because she'd never experienced me having boundaries as before. Gerald, predictably, never called at all. Brittany did, actually, a few times, awkward and stilted at first, then slowly less so. She asked me, once almost shyly, if she could take me out for coffee sometime. Just us, no agenda. We went. It was strange and a little sad, and also the first real conversation we'd had in 20 years that wasn't filtered through our parents' expectations of who we were supposed to be to each other. Desmond passed away 18 months later, quietly in his sleep, the way he probably would have wanted, after a full life that included, near its very end, walking a young woman who wasn't his blood across a stage in front of strangers and clapping like it was the proudest moment of his entire life. I spoke at his small memorial alongside his actual children, who hugged me afterward and told me he'd talked about my graduation for months, that he'd kept a framed photo of the two of us in the atrium on his bookshelf, right next to a photo of his wife. I still see Brittany every few weeks now, mostly for coffee, sometimes for dinner. My relationship with my mother is civil, occasionally warm, permanently changed. I don't resent any of them anymore, not really. I think the version of me who needed them to show up has mostly made peace with the version of me who learned. Finally, that family is sometimes a thing you're born into, and sometimes a thing that shows up at your door with a wrench, fixes what's broken without being asked, and then simply stays.